Well, this is just a presentation I made about my 6-month position working with the California Condor Recovery Program, and I was based in Southern California. My office space was in Ventura, California, where I worked in partnership with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but most of my working time was spent out in the field, and I was split between 2 different wildlife refuges. So, but I can get more into that later. But this is just a presentation about my job. And Dr. P, if you want to interject with questions at any time, you totally can.
Okay, can you still hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, and you just tell me when you want the next slide.
Okay, I am ready for the next slide.
All right, this is always fun.
So I was just going to start off with a little bit of background information about the California Condor and its conservation story up to this point. The California Condor is the largest land bird in North America, and it historically lived across the entire southern United States all the way to Florida, as well as extending up the Pacific coast. I think it went into like Canada at some point in its historic range. And in the 1960s, its population had been declining so drastically that it got listed as endangered in 1967. And by the time the 80s rolled around, there were less than 25 left in the wild. And when it got down to 23 condors, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and their partner organizations made a really drastic decision to remove all of the birds from the wild and place them into a captive breeding program. And one of the reasons I think this story is so famous is because a lot of the decisions that conservationists made for the species were unprecedented. They had not been done before on another species, and they just went to extreme measures to preserve the existence of this species. And with the specific choice to remove all the condors from the wild, this actually was a really tough decision between the U.S. government and local indigenous tribes. And the Chumash tribe is one that I learned about the most during my time in Southern California. Granted, I still don't know a ton, but I learned enough to know that one of their prayer rituals is that they believe that they cannot send up prayers unless there is a condor flying in the sky, because they believe that the condors carried their prayers to their deities. And so when there was talk of removing all the condors from the wild, they were rightly upset because they were like, we can't pray if you take all these birds out of the wild. And it was a contentious decision, but in the end, they were all removed. And I know there was discussion at one point about, leaving like 1 or 2 for the Chumash tribe, but they decided with so few left, they needed all of the gene pool that they had left to try and save the species. So that was a pretty big deal. And so they were in a captive breeding program for a really long time. And before they started reintroducing the species back into the wild, they did another drastic measure where they translocated Andean condors from South America into the southwestern range of California condors. And their hope for doing this was to have an existing group of condors, albeit a different species, to kind of be there to help the newly introduced California condors adjust to life in the wild. Because at that point, the new releases that they were putting out had not lived in the wild before, and so they didn't know how to function as a wild bird, basically. And so the Andean condors were kind of there to show them how to find food sites, the best places to roost and nest, and just kind of help the condors figure it out. And once enough California condors were placed in the wild, all of the Andeans were taken back to South America. So there are no more Andean condors in the United States. But yeah, really drastic measures to save this species. Oh, and I'm ready for the next slide.
Okay.
And just some fun facts about the California condor. They are the last remaining species of the genus called Gymnogyps, and they're actually the smallest of the genus to have ever existed. Their wingspan is up to 9 to 10 feet, and the larger members of their genus had wingspans of up to 13 feet. So they think that a lot of the California condors' close relatives went extinct after all of our large mammals died off, like the mammoths and stuff like that, because there just weren't enough large prey to sustain such large scavengers. So the California condor is the only one that stuck around, and they feed primarily on elk and other ungulates and bovids of that size. And the average lifespan of the California condor isn't fully known, part of which is because once we started studying condors, they were, like their population was decreasing, and so, and a lot of that was due to lead poisoning. So we don't really have a super good understanding yet of what the average lifespan of a condor is where it dies of natural causes rather than lead toxicosis or being shot or other like non-natural deaths. But I think that the oldest condor in the wild right now is up to 40 years old, and they have one in captivity that's even older than that. So they live a very long time. And the K-selected species bullet was also for the conservation biology class, just to have an example of a species that puts a lot of energy into few offspring rather than having lots of offspring and taking their chances. Condors only have one chick every other year on average, and so they don't reproduce quickly, and their population grows slowly because of that. And they're also a really cool species because they can travel up to 150 miles a day in search of food. And so protecting the condor is really protecting really large landscape scale habitat, which is really cool. And so a lot of the habitat protection efforts for these birds is connecting different national forests in California. And in Arizona and Utah, there are some smaller populations there as well. But by protecting habitat for these birds, it benefits lots and lots of other flora and fauna, which is pretty cool. And condors are really intelligent and very social birds, which I learned while I was out there working with them. They have really defined social hierarchies, and you can tell when they're on like one wildlife refuge where there are shared food resources and like different nesting territories in close proximity, you get to see these interactions play out and see like very clearly who the dominant condors are and those that are defending their territories and just kind of terrorizing the younger and more submissive condors. And they have really complex relationships too. I kind of see them as having romantic relationships like people. Sometimes a pair will stay together for life, and other times they split up if they're like not having a successful time with their breeding attempts, and other times they'll like cheat on each other. It's pretty dramatic, and it was really fun to keep up with like all of their relationships because they do have really complex ones. And another fun fact is they are often bullied by ravens, and I learned that it's because it's likely because they compete for similar food resources. And obviously, at a carcass site, a condor is going to push all the ravens out of the way and get a lot of the food. And so the ravens are really creative, and like a big flock of them will show up at a carcass when condors are feeding. And they do this thing called mock flushing, where all the ravens take off at once to try and scare the condors into thinking that there's a threat approaching and the condors need to take off too. And so once the condors take off, they're really big, and it takes them a long time to circle back around and land again. But the ravens are smaller, they're quicker, they're more agile, so they'll just come right back down to the carcass and get in some bites while the condors are still like soaring overhead and coming back to land. So
wow, that's super cool, huh?
yeah, and the ravens also will like pull on the condor's tail feathers because when condors like harass each other, that's one of the behaviors they do, is they'll like tug on the tail feathers of the other bird. And so like ravens do that too. And it's really funny because sometimes the condors just sit there and they let the ravens bully them. And maybe it's because they have a slow metabolism and they don't like to waste a lot of energy. And so they would just rather not move and let the ravens pick at them. But it's pretty funny to watch them do it. So, yeah.
Next slide.
Yeah. And this is just, these are 2 pictures I took on both of the refuges I worked at. So the picture on the left is Hopper Mountain National Wildlife Refuge. And it's kind of a foggy sunset, but beyond those mountains over the fog is the Pacific Ocean. And on the right-hand side is Bitter Creek National Wildlife Refuge, and that's a little farther north and more inland. But these are both like really good examples of condor habitat because they rely on thermal updrafts, and so they like to be in mountainous areas where that happens often because of how the air moves through the valleys and stuff like that. And so this is like a prime example of where condors choose to live, and it's like really open areas so they can like scan for food easily as well. And so this is just examples of where I did most of my field work. So it was just gorgeous and really special to get to work in these places.
Ready for the next slide?
Yes. And I thought I would just give an overview of the California Condor Recovery Program, which is led by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but there are dozens of other organizations that are involved to make this possible. But the goal of this program is to eventually delist the species, of course, and to do that they have to, or their plan at least, is to establish at least 2 geographically distinct self-sustaining wild populations, each of these having at least 150 birds and 15 breeding pairs, as well as a 3rd captive population to supplement the wild population growth, because these birds reproduce slowly and their population doesn't grow quickly on its own. And so if we were to just manage in the wild and not supplement with captive raised reintroduction, the population would not be at the point where it is today, and we would have a lot more trouble than we're currently having. But I got those 2 bullet points from the recovery program's website. That's part of their species survival plan. But we're now like in what's called the final phase of the recovery, and so we have like a fairly good number of condors. I mean, compared to 23, we've got over 500 now, which is really awesome in how, like, almost 30 years, I guess. And so the focus right now is to get the populations that currently exist in the wild to be self-sustaining as soon as we can. And for my position, I was working with the Southern California population, which is the largest. And at the time that I left, there were just under 100 birds in that population. There's also a wild population farther up north in California, kind of near Cambria and Big Sur. And then there's a population in Arizona near the Grand Canyon. And I think there's also one in Utah and in Baja California. But Southern California is the largest. So yeah, I'm ready for the next slide.
All right.
And this is just an overview of my position that I had for 6 months. And I was not technically a government employee. I worked for an NGO called the Great Basin Institute, but pretty much all of my time I was working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I just wasn't an employee for them. But my major job responsibilities were to assist with the management of the wild population in Southern California, and I did this mostly by tracking the birds using radio telemetry and checking GPS transmitter data when we weren't getting them with the radio transmitters. And I also got to be there for one of the biannual trapping seasons, and so I got to trap condors and handle them for what we called workups, or the biannual health checks that we did. And I can explain more of that later as well. I also did a lot of observing and documenting of condor behavior from a distance, so I'd just be watching them on one mountain side to another through a spotting scope, and depending on what I was trying to observe, I'd have different data sheets just to be collecting data on our birds and what they're doing. And all of the data that I collected was to help with the management effort for the species. And I also did a lot of reporting information back to the central office in Ventura, because a lot of times I was out in the field alone and I was responsible for sharing information with the Condor team back in the office. And my next couple slides get into each of these bullet points a little bit more. So I'm ready. So tracking condors was a huge part of my daily routine. And we used very high frequency radio telemetry. And so in this picture on the left, you can't see it super well. I have a better picture later on. But the person in this picture is holding a Yagi, which is like a big metal apparatus that you would like walk in a circle with, and that's what you use to detect radio signals. And so at any given time, like around 80 to 90% of our population had a working VHF transmitter, which is pictured on the right. These are from two different birds, and we would attach these radio transmitters to the tail feathers of our condors during our health checks. And so, of course, birds molt their feathers, and so the trackers are not permanent, and that's another reason that we have our biannual trapping season, so that we can kind of stay on top of which bird needs a new radio tracker, because ideally all of our birds would have them all the time, but that's just not really possible. So we try to have it as close to 100% as we can, and then supplement with GPS trackers, which we would put on their wings instead of their tails. And so most days I would go out and do what's called a signal set, where I would go to a really high point on refuge with a 360 clear view of the mountains and valleys around me. And that is where I would take signals, and I would scan through every member of our population that had a transmitter. And if I got a signal for a bird, I would record its strength and its direction. And so that's kind of how we kept track of birds without actually seeing them. We could say that we like signaled them in this particular direction on this day at this time. And so that kind of helped us keep track of them if we didn't see them one day.
Wow, that's so cool.
Yeah. So I got a lot of really thorough experience with tracking with radio telemetry. I could probably do it in my sleep now. It was a huge part of the job. So yeah, it was a great experience. And monitoring new releases was a big part of my position, because I worked from October to April. And they only have one period each year where they release captive bred birds, and it happens October to December. And so I got to be there for the whole thing. And I mentioned a little bit earlier about how we need to supplement the wild population with captive bred birds just to help the population grow faster than it otherwise would, with how few birds there are, at least. And so reintroducing these chicks is really important to boosting their numbers. And so the way it works is there are a couple partner zoos in Southern California that have captive breeding programs for California condors, and chicks usually hatch in May. And so around August, our refuge complex will get a bunch of these captive raised chicks that are a couple months old at this point, and they've already fledged, and we put them in this flight pen facility on refuge, and it's like an enclosed area, but it's like a fence. I don't really know what to call the fence, but it's something that the condors are exposed to the external environment, and so they're getting a taste of what the temperature fluctuations are like, what the wind is like, and just getting used to the environment that they're going to be released into, basically. And so the birds are kind of just in this flight pen facility from August to October. And during that time, we monitor them really closely from a blind, so they can't see us, but we can watch them. And we keep track of how their weight is progressing, if they're eating, and how they're interacting with each other, and each individual bird's health status. And so we're monitoring them for months, getting ready to see who's going to get released first once October rolls around. And so that's kind of the process that I was doing when I first started. And then we started releasing these birds in small batches every 2 weeks once October started. And so we would usually release 2 to 3 condors every other Wednesday. And we would do them in small batches so that we could really keep a close eye on these newly released birds for the first 2 weeks that they're in the wild. And I did a ton of tracking these birds. And so basically what would happen is I would go out like right before the sun came up, and I would try to find anyway, where these newly released birds are roosting. And it's a really good day if you can find all of the new released birds' roost sites in the morning and at night, because that just makes it so much easier to find them the next morning if you can find where they roosted at night. And during the day, I would watch them to see if they're flying, how long they're flying, and how well their flight looks. Because usually the new released birds are really weak once they first get out into the environment, because they've been able to fly in their flight pen, but they haven't been able to soar over these huge valleys that are present in their actual habitat. So it's important for us to be able to watch them and see how their strength is developing and their ability to find the feeding sites so that they can get food on their own. And so it was just a lot of really intense monitoring for these couple months for our newly released birds. And I also used radio telemetry to track these birds, because we would put transmitters on them right before we released them. And I can go into more detail about the release process too if you're interested.
Ready? Oh, sorry. Ready for the next slide?
Yeah, I'm ready. Another big responsibility in my job was just general observation of condors. And so a lot of my observation was on the new releases, like I just mentioned. But another category of birds that I observed were fledglings that were hatched in the wild by wild parents. And so the picture here is, it's part of a nesting territory at one of the refuges. And so you can't see the nest in this picture, but if you follow like the line of the scope, I was looking across this really big valley. And that's not me, that's my friend, Laurel, laying down. I was watching from a scope a little higher up. But I would monitor these fledglings, and we would go out to their nest sites usually 2 or 3 times a week, because they're often really remote sites that take a while to hike to. And I would just camp there for a couple hours and document their interactions with their parents, if anyone came to feed them while I was there. And once they start hopping and flapping and eventually flying, so that we can get them a fledge date. And so that was really fun, because I got to watch a lot of chicks that hatched in the wild in 2019. I got to watch them fledge and take their first flight, which was just so exciting. And it was just always really special when you see one of the wild babies flying for the first time. So, and then more generally, like, it was very important for us to watch condors so we could stay on track with if any of these birds are having a deteriorating health status, because lead poisoning is a huge threat for condors, and it's probably why they went so far down in numbers in the first place. And so we were like trained on the warning signs of what it looks like if a bird is suffering from lead poisoning, and then acting accordingly to like capture the bird and get them taken into the zoo for treatment. And that is happening it didn't happen a lot while I was there, thankfully, but that's just always something that we are looking out for with these birds.
Next slide.
Yeah. And these are just a couple pictures of some field work. So this picture in the middle is a nesting territory that I was observing one day. And the picture on the left is an active nest, and you can see the egg. And the condor in that photo is the...
There where the little cursor is now?
Yep, yeah, that's the egg. And the condor on it is the mother of that egg. And I had been watching her for a while that afternoon, and I was waiting for her to stand up and stretch her legs so I could get a picture of the egg. So I had to wait a while to get that picture. I took it through my scope. I was far enough away that her behavior was not affected by my presence. Like, I was super far away. And on the far right is just a picture of another refuge on a day that I was tracking some newly released birds in the fall. So just really pretty views. But yeah, those were just some pictures I took. Yeah, I'm ready for the next slide. And another big part of my job was trapping season. And so this followed the same timeline as releasing the captive bred birds. So it happened from October to December as well. And so for this, we would be focused on trapping members of the wild population. And our goal during each trapping season is to trap every bird, even if they don't need a new radio transmitter, because they are keeping tabs on the level of lead in the blood for each bird. And so it's important to get tabs on as many of the wild birds as possible. And so with each bird that we managed to trap, we would give it like a quick physical examination, take a blood sample, replace its tail transmitter if it needed a new one, and sometimes we would change out the GPS transmitter on their wing. And the other fun part of doing these little workup sessions was we would change their patagial wing tag. And so each individual in the population has a unique identifier, and it's a wing tag that is color coded and it has a number. And I have some that I got to keep because we would change the wing tags on every single bird, because after a while they get faded, the edges start to curl up, and it's hard to ID them in the field if they have a really crappy wing tag. And so these are some of the wing tags that I got to keep from workups. And so this is a green wing tag with the number 48. And so the color tells us the first digit of the Condor stud book number. So it's a 3-digit number for this bird. So this is Condor number 748. So the green is our 700 series, and then the 48 is pretty straightforward. There's one on this side. You can't see it as well, but it's a blue tag. So this was from Condor 326. And so I got to keep some wing tags as we put new ones on them. So that was really fun. So, and Dr. P, I'm going to give you one of these next time I see you. But I got to clean it off too. It's been in a bag because I haven't sterilized it yet, because condors aren't the cleanest birds. But yeah, so I have a present for you. But yeah, so like the workup sessions were my personal favorite part of the job, because I got to like handle these birds and like learn how to like hold them while we're doing the checkups and stuff. And they're just these enormous birds, and it like I had to like wrap my entire arms around them just to hold them properly. And I have a picture later on of what it looks like to hold one. And it was just so special to get to like experience up close what these like really famous endangered species are like. And yeah, so trapping and handling the condors was super, super fun. And we did it for very serious reasons, but it was such a privilege to get to be part of that. Oh yeah, and I guess I put some details on how we trap the condors. But I mentioned earlier we have a flight pen facility on each refuge, and so during trapping season there is or all the time on the flight pen facility, there's an additional like structure, and it's called a double door trap. And so there's one door that is open to the outside, and there's a second door that connects the trap to the actual flight pen. And so I would be stationed inside the blind, and I would operate the trap doors, and it was basically just a strategic way to get condors into the trap from the outside and close that door, and then open the door to the flight pen so they would go in there, and then they would be held in there for the next workup. And they were always provided with food, and I can answer any questions about that you might have. But so it was a very hands-off approach to trapping the condors, and they never see people. That's one of the big protocol with the program. We try to like remove ourselves as much as possible from the lives of the condor, so they don't associate people with food or water or anything, ideally.
Jessy, what does it mean on your slide, stealth birds?
Oh, I totally forgot about that. Yeah, so a stealth bird is basically, that is what we called condors that did not have a GPS unit on their wing, and they also did not have a tail transmitter. So sometimes we have birds that just don't get GPS units in the first place because they're really expensive, and so we don't have them on every single bird in the population yet. But sometimes birds will just have tail transmitters, but when they drop their tail feather that the transmitter is attached to, those are the birds we call stealth birds, because we can no longer track them with VHF telemetry, and we have no way of getting GPS data for them because they don't have a GPS unit. And so those birds, when trapping season rolls around, they're one of our really high priorities because we don't want to have stealth birds. We want to be able to keep track of every member of the population, so we can see like if they're not moving for more than 12 hours and they're like completely stationary, the VHF transmitter will start giving a mortality signal where it's beeping really fast. And so if a stealth bird was stationary for more than 12 hours, we would have no way of knowing that they are potentially in trouble. So there are kind of like really high priorities for trapping, basically.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Next slide. Are you ready for the next slide?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
And these are just some more pictures. The one on the left is me releasing a bird. And fun fact, that's Condor 748. So this is that condor's old wing tag, and the one in the picture is his fresh new wing tag. And then all the way on the right is just kind of a table, and this was a really big workup day. We had 20 condors that day. So you can see all the wing tags laid out on the table, and those were all the birds that we had in the flight pen ready to get their health checks and change out their gear and their wing tags. And you can see on some of them, like the red tag with the number 11, there's like a little gray unit on it, and that is a tail transmitter. So, and then further up you can see like there's some larger objects on some of the other tags, and those are GPS units. So that's just kind of like how we organized it for a really big workup, where like some of the birds needed new transmitters, and they were just ready to go on that bird's wing tag when we got to that bird. And then the thing in the middle, I think Dr. P, you might be able to click on it. That should be a video,
Okay.
Unless I just took a screenshot of it, in which case it's just a picture.
Yeah, I think it's just a picture.
Okay, never mind. But that's kind of a picture of the outside of one of our double door traps. And I was in a blind, and it was like one-way glass, so that condor could not see in. But that was a bird that I spent hours and hours and hours trying to trap, because you can see in the bottom right, the trap door is open and there's bait inside, but the condor is just like sitting on this rail, and it's so long to figure out that the food was through the door. And so that bird took a long time to catch, but he was one of our wild hatched chicks, and that bird was 1.5 years old. So he was a 2018 baby. So yeah, those are just some pictures from trapping stuff.
Now, do you think he was like, I was trying to catch your tone. Do you think he was like not very smart because he couldn't get in to get to the thing, or he was very wary of the trap?
I don't know, because lots of the birds are extremely trap wary, and so especially at this refuge that I was trapping at in that picture, the birds on that refuge are very far removed from civilization, and so they do not trust this trap. And so it would take a really long time for one bird to get brave enough to go through and then other birds to follow it. But this bird would just kind of like walk around the flight pen, and it just didn't seem to be nervous. So I don't know if he was just a confused little baby, because most of the adults are really shy and wary, and this bird wasn't quite as wary as they were. So I don't know if he was just figuring it all out, but it just cracked me up at the time.
You ready for the next slide?
Yeah.
Oh, there's the video.
Oh! Yeah, and he can see his reflection in the one-way glass from where he's perched right now, but could not see me. So yeah, that's pretty much it.
Okay.
And yeah, so I was not always in the field alone, but on the occasions that I was, it was really important that I communicated with my supervisory biologists that were out of the field. And so I would send like weekly update emails to like everybody on the team just to kind of let them know how the birds are doing and what's going on in the field, basically. And so there would be some times when I would be observing birds and they'd be showing some like behavioral signs or just like other cues that I had questions about because it didn't look like normal condor behavior. And so I would be pretty often communicating with my biologist and telling them like what I'm seeing these condors do and like asking if that's normal behavior or if I should be concerned. And so those are just the bullet points for some birds that me and my fellow technicians would be in communication with biologists about sometimes, because Condor 796 gave us a scare at one point because it looked like it was limping, and so during trapping season we tried to catch this bird and get it taken down to one of our partner zoos to get an x-ray to see if its leg was broken. And we were able to trap it, get it down for some x-rays, and found out its leg was perfectly fine and they couldn't determine any other health issues with the bird. And so sometimes we would just have situations like that where like the technicians in the field had to ask a lot of questions of our supervisors and stuff. And I put this picture in here. This is one of the UTVs that I operated on refuge, and the soil in Southern California has a lot of clay in it, and so when it rains, the dirt turns into this. And so like this is a great four-wheel drive UTV, but with enough of this like wet clay sticking to the tire, I eventually got stuck and I had to call for help for someone to come bring me a shovel so I could start scraping the mud off. But yeah, so it was just a constant like problem-solving environment and like figuring out what to do in these like unpredictable situations. And I found it really fun and just super exciting. So yeah, I don't know what the next slide is, but I am ready for it.
There you go.
Oh, yeah, just some more pictures. So this is a condor that I was getting ready to release, and they're these giant birds, but they average about 20 pounds, so they're not super heavy, but they're very feisty. And unlike other raptors, you don't have to worry about their talons as much because they don't use their talons to grip their prey and to like tear their prey apart. That's what their beak is for. And so and they have a really strong neck, and so like keeping them like properly and comfortably restrained while handling them was crucial for the safety of the bird and for us. So I remember the first time I held one, I was terrified, but it's just a really special experience, and it's really fun. And yeah, there's a better picture in the top right of a Yagi, which is what I used for tracking with radio telemetry. And then in the bottom right, we had several like field trips come out to Refuge where we would teach like school kids about the program and endangered species in general, and just kind of give them opportunities to get outside the classroom and see what is happening and what it's all about. And so that was really fun too. And yeah, it was just a really awesome job. I would totally do it again. And I think that's pretty much all of the material I had. So I don't know if you've got any questions, and I can elaborate on stuff too.
Let's see. I'm going to see if I can put my video back in. Wow. That was super. Thanks so much, Jessy.
Yeah.
Do you know, like the average age when they become sexually mature, is it a little, take them a few years?
It does. Usually when they hit 6 to 7 years old, that's when they start having first attempts for breeding.
Wow. So yeah, they're not going to be trying to mate their first couple years. They got to grow up.
Yeah, it does take them a while.
Wow. Well, this was really awesome. Thank you so much. I am going to stop the recording.
Okay.
Right now.